So thank you very much for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. So the talk of today, it's on severance pay. It's also a theoretical contribution, a conceptual contribution to the issue. I had some premises in the. So this doesn't work, or maybe because it was this one. Yeah, you can read. Yeah, that was useful. So the outline is just to give you an idea. There are various issues that we cover in this in the paper. I will not have the time to cover it all, but this is the outline of the entire research. So I start with an introduction, then I go a brief detail of the research, existing research on severance payment, and then in terms of the theoretical contribution, I will focus on a two-periods model to give the intuition of what we are doing, even though we are interested in the long-term relationship between severance payment and tenure. The general equilibrium, I will skip it, but it is also the part of this research is taking legislation extremely seriously and taking the law linked to the labor, to the employment protection legislation extremely seriously, and so we also have a part on the burden of proof and endogenous court ruling. And then I will, if I have time, I will try to go back to the empirical implication. Now, the premises, they were already done in the introductory speech, so I can go pretty quickly. Just remind us in our background, I was talking to Spaniard colleague that, for example, in 2007, Spain unemployment was 8%, and it tripled since the big crisis. And at the beginning of the crisis, the financial crisis, European unemployment was lower than the US unemployment, which now is 6%. So on this we can go fairly quickly on also on the youth that we know that there is a risk of losing an entire generation. Duality, which is the topic of today presentation, we should also bear in mind there is a huge variation across Europe. It's not a plug for all countries. Of course, it is for Southern European countries, and Poland is probably the most interesting, and I'm looking forward to learning a lot. But in other countries, fixed-term employment is not an issue, particularly around Germany, Austria, where actually also youth unemployment is around 10% or below 10%. So there is a variety of that. Anyway, so this is, let me start mainly on this one. So, of course, eventually the falling youth unemployment has to do with growth. I think ultimately, if you need robust growth for having unemployment to go back to what it was 6 or 7 years ago, and the problem is much broader than employment than labor market institutions. So we mainly do research on labor market institutions, but we should realize that it's not labor market institution that will, by designing perfect labor market institution, we will get unemployment back to where it should be. And so maybe the only exception is labor taxes, while EPL, which is what I will talk in today, collective bargaining, unemployment benefits, minimum wages, are difficult that are going to lead to a substantial fall in unemployment. But duality as such, as basically duality as a pathology, as probably is in Poland, and it's definitely the case in Southern European countries, and in my country, which is Italy, has to do with institution. So in this perspective, even if we know that it has a limited impact, the labor market institution on unemployment as such, potentially, it has clearly an impact on duality. And so research must be carried out in order to able to tackle this issue of this very extensive and large labor market duality in some European sense. And policy, so research and policy is also important to contribute to this issue. So in various countries, there is this idea of a contract, a labor contract that should help countries going beyond duality, basically a long-term contract with severance payments that are increasing with tenure. Actually, my country is today going through a confidence vote, the Italian Parliament, for passing a broad set of laws, which includes a new contract, which the details has to be specified, but is trying to implement something similar to what has been discussed in the policy circles. And this is there are similar ideas in France, in Spain. So while this policy exists, this research is trying to say, does it make sense? So under which conditions such a contract that we are advocating in many European countries, does it make sense? And this is the motivating question behind this research, which is joint with Tito Boeri, which is in Bocconi, and Espen Moen, which is now at the University of Oslo. Okay, so let's go back to the research on severance payment. It's an extensive research. What do we know by severance payment? Now, first, let's be clear. Severance payment is just one dimension of employment protection legislation. Employment protection legislation, it's a broad set of institutions which has to do with protecting labor. Severance payment is a transfer, typically mandatory, for employer-initiated separation. It is a pure transfer. Now, it's a large part of variation across the OECD index of employment protection has to do with severance payment, but it's only part of it. That's an important dimension. And often when such transfers are not specified by the law, they are typically designed in collective agreement. Even in the US, that has no mandatory severance payment, there are severance payments which are specified by collective bargaining. And we will have something to say on it. So this is, now it's working. Now, and the topics, the discussion is mainly about individual dismissal. Okay, so this is typically for individual dismissal, while it is not for collective dismissal. So that's important. Now, what do we know about? Why do they exist? Now, you have to start with the big question: why do they exist? There are some very important results. The most important one is the Lazier. The Lazier, that everybody should probably, that is interested in employment protection legislation, should read that paper, which basically tell you that severance payments are irrelevant. Well, it's a very benchmark case, and we should always start from benchmark situation. Basically, under a perfectly competitive labor market with flexible wages, if you specify a mandatory severance payment, then this is undone, is completely undone by a perfect labor contract. So it has no allocative impact. It's just a pure transfer with no allocative impact. So it is irrelevant. So this is called the neutrality result. So we should know that in the benchmark case, severance payments are just irrelevant. Now then, the question why they exist is still there, but we should know that from the economic standpoint, in a positive sense, we have this, in a perfect labor market, we have these results. Now, if wages are fixed, then with rigid wages, part of my research with Gianluca Violante was that basically they end up increasing unemployment because you cannot basically undo this effect. It's not a particularly surprising result because you cannot undo this effect if wages are rigid at entrance. In fact, in most of the research that you have been probably going through, employment protection is modeled as a firing tax. Firing tax is something different. So firing tax is basically a tax that it's a payment that the firm has to do and is dissipated, is outside the party. And it doesn't really exist much. Okay, there is red tape in employment protection legislation. Much of the bulk of employment protection is to do with severance payment. Now, another result is that if individuals are risk averse, then typically there are other institutions which are more efficient in providing insurance, and Blanchard and Tirole suggested that experience-related unemployment insurance is actually a much more desirable institution. Okay, so we have a general results here that if wages are deferred, and we'll come back to this, basically deferred wages means backloading, that you end up basically paying most of the wage toward the end of the employment relationship, then under that condition, firms have strong incentive to fire senior workers. So in this case, and then of course you need a story of why wages tend to be deferred, then severance payment can improve efficiency, even if wages are flexible and the workers are risk neutral. So basically, we find a story for saying, well, under these conditions, there must be some imperfect information, but wages are, severance payments are actually efficient. And we analyze this basically in a model where workers need to invest, so there is a human capital investing motives in a specific investment, so that's the reason for the backloading of wages, so that you end up paying most of the wages at the end of the employment relationship. And the idea is that firms cannot commit not to fire. that's a typical thing. There are very rarely, even in real life labor market, firms basically always have the option. They cannot basically commit ex ante not to fire. So this is it's not a tremendous assumption. So with this setting, then we will go on and asking, okay, if we need now we have a story for severance payment, finally. So does it make sense to have it increasing in tenure? And the answer is yes, under certain conditions. Now, we have to take extremely seriously the legislation. It's clearly that if you read the employment protection legislation, we have typically, the legislation is messy, but you have two typically form of dismissal. There is disciplinary dismissal, which has to do with worker misconduct. So worker misconduct is basically, it's a shirking behavior on the part of workers. So disciplinary dismissal takes place when the worker is not behaving properly. It's very different from an economic dismissal, which is basically the worker has not done anything wrong, but the firm is doing poorly. So in the first case is a shirker, the second case the firm is not selling well, and so, sorry, I need to destroy your job because we are not doing well. So that's an economic dismissal. Now, each type of the two, typical legislation, can be distinguished between fair and unfair. Fair, basically, and it is specified somewhat in the law, but it's very difficult ex ante to say exactly what is a fair or an unfair dismissal, independently of whether it's economic or disciplinary. So eventually you need a court ruling. Okay? You cannot get completely rid of the court once you take seriously and you try to understand what these institutions are. Now, we provide some measure. Here I go fairly briefly, but it's interesting to basically to find measure of the different, in terms of monthly wages, of the different type of dismissals. Also because it gives a sense of how difficult it is ex ante from the firm to know exactly what is the cost of dismissal, because it depends whether, of course, what the court will say and whether there will be a court ruling or not, and how long such a court ruling will last. Now, an unfair dismissal, of course, in terms of monthly wages, you can include also the notice periods. In our view, you may not agree, basically when you give notice, the job is already dead. From that moment, from the moment you start giving notice, it's already part of the cost. Then you add the severance payment. And then if you lose into court with this probability pi, then there is, you have to pay the lengthy, the trial period, which is D, of course, times the monthly wage, plus either you need to reinstate it or there is an additional severance payment. That's why you have another S there. So that's in the case of unfair dismissal. Then you have different and typically lower value in the case of economic fair or disciplinary fair. Now, you have too many numbers here, but you have a sense of what you should get of this one. First, that we basically were able to distinguish between TU is the unfair, is the transfer in the case of unfair. EF means economic fair and disciplinary, TD. Now, typically what you see is that the unfair is the largest and is larger than economic, and the economic is larger than disciplinary. That's, if you have a ranking of the three, this is what it says. And there is a huge standard deviation among these measures. So this is a sense of it's very difficult to predict the exact cost from the firm standpoint. It's a sort of almost of a lottery. This is true in most countries. And so there is also some discretion of judges involved into this process. Now, the second thing, it has to do with the link between severance payment and tenure. And basically, we go and check in every country how severance payment change with tenure. And we have a picture. You cannot see much from this one. But basically, in 50% of the country, it is increasing in tenure. Actually, I was checking that Poland is actually fairly steep. So I want to learn more exactly of how this contract applies to different type of workers, so that will help me during the day. But basically, there is a huge variation. So how do we make sense of this one? This is not being explored in the existing research of this relationship between tenure, which is fixed term. Of course, overcoming fixed term has to do a lot with increasing tenure of employment spell and severance payment. So that's one feature which we'll use toward the end. Now, finally, before starting to give you the sense of the economics, there is also in most of legislation, there is exemption for small firms. This is true in Italy, in Germany, in Australia, I don't know, in Poland, for example. Of course, for regular employment, typically small firms are exempted from severance payment, or they have lower mandated severance payment. Why is that the case? We will have something to say on it. Okay, so this large introduction. So how much time I have? Just to plan my... Yeah, and still 20... Okay, so... Good. Okay, so we are here. So now I give you the story. There will be some math, but I try to be very little to give you the basic two periods model and to have a sense of why a severance payment can be efficient under which condition. So it's actually a little but important story. So let's start with the simplest model, which is in partial equilibrium. We have one worker and one firm, and they are risk neutral. Okay? So a job lasts 2 periods, so it's not really a long-term job, and there is no discounting. It's the simplest setting you can have. One firm, one worker, partial equilibrium. Now, the firm has the ability to offer a wage contract, and it's all, so the firm has the power to set the wages, and the worker can accept or reject, and the contract is basically, it's a 2-period wages. So the firm commit to the wages in period 1 and the wage in period 2. Okay, it's a long-term contract, even though it's only 2 periods. And of course, you commit to the second period wages. Not to employment in the second period, we will see. Now, the firm, the worker, there is a specific investment. So the worker has an opportunity to invest in the first period, and it costs C. So there is an investment cost, call it C, in the first period. Now, without investment, the output is Y. Now, let's say that the worker outside the option is B. So if B is greater than Y, that means that without investment, the job does not make sense. So the worker is better outside than in the firm without job. So that's to make it extremely simple. Now, but investment, it's a risk investment. Basically, it increases productivity, but it increases productivity in a stochastic sense, in the sense that if the worker does invest, productivity will go from Y to Y plus epsilon, but epsilon is a draw from a distribution. Okay? So the idea is that productivity does go up with specific investment, but in a stochastic sense. So sometimes we'll have a better job, but it can even be a worse job, which potentially leads to firing. You understand? Now, the idea also to extreme is that the firm observes productivity, so productivity is observed by the firm, and only the worker observes investment. So there is asymmetric information there, and it makes sense in reality. Think of this investment almost as effort, if you want to think of that you have to make effort today in order to be productive tomorrow. That's a way to understand this specific investment. And productivity, typically the firm has a better information than the worker on the state of the job. Okay? That's an important slide. Now, in this case, it is clearly that you have 2 types of dismissal. First, a disciplinary dismissal. What is a disciplinary dismissal? A disciplinary dismissal is basically has to do with shirking. Okay? So let's say that it is about a worker who did not invest. Let's call this a disciplinary investment. You are a bad worker in the sense that you did not invest. It's not that we are doing poorly, but it's that you didn't invest. Now, the problem is that this fact that the worker was somewhat lazy must be proved in court. At this point, we take the court ruling as given, but the key idea is that from the first standpoint, the court ruling is a stochastic event. There is a chance that the court say, no, the guy was not a lazy guy. The guy was a properly working guy, so he's entitled to severance payment. So that's the key point, in the sense that with a probability Q, the worker gets away with it. Basically, he was a shirker, but somehow the court ruled that he was not shirking and is entitled to severance payments, capital T. So he can get away with it. Basically, it means not investing and get the severance payment is fired. It's very different than from an economic dismissal. Then economic dismissal is basically, it's the guy the worker did properly invest, but then he was unlucky in the sense that productivity turned out to be low. The firm cannot commit not to fire, so the firm will start the dismissal. And in this case, the severance payment is due with certainty, with probability 1, and it's capital T. Let's say that T is set at this stage from the government, and it's a pure transfer. So we have nothing to do, it's not dissipated, it's just it's a transfer that goes to the worker. Okay, so you see that immediately we get these two type of dismissal which exist in any legislation. Now I can get back to this one, but you can say why the firm, this is more technical, why the firm cannot contract over T, why we need the government to set up, why? Well, there is a potentially, you can understand, with an adverse selection problem. I can get back to this at the end, but basically let's accept that it is the government who has to set up, and the firm cannot write in the contract only the severance payment. So you can argue why do we need the state? Should it be the firm that can do it? Well, with heterogeneity there is an adverse selection problem potentially. But I can tell you the story, but it becomes more technical. But of course we thought about it. Now let's talk about firing now in our story. So it's clearly that of course a shirking worker is always fired. No, we say it's clearly because productivity is below the reservation wage, so there is no make sense. So of course he's fired. Now the interesting case is that how about the investing worker, the good guy? He's going to be fired. Well, of course, if it's fired, where basically the firm is a simple firing rule, which is basically, let's say that it will fire if basically the net profit, which could be basically productivity minus the wages, you can think of Y2 minus W2, it's lower than the severance payment. Because at that point, if I keep the worker, I have to pay him Y2 minus W2. So, sorry, I net out in terms of profit Y2, which is productivity minus the wage. If I fire him, I have to pay the severance payment. So you fire him if productivity is below to the difference between WT minus T, and you can basically define a reservation productivity, which is just when these things are equal, which is epsilon D, which is equal to that formula there. Okay, if epsilon is below that epsilon D, think of D as distraction, then you will fire the worker. Okay, that's very simple. The firm works in that way. Now, in this simple setting, we know exactly very well what is efficient. Which job should be kept in place in the second period? In the second period, any job for which basically the productivity is larger than the outside option, there is surplus. Economic surplus you have in a job if the total productivity is larger than the outside option. So if basically is the difference between B minus W. So any job which is above that should be kept. If productivity is below the outside option, it should be destroyed. Now, of course, there is no reason for which these two formulas are identical. This is going to be true only if you have a positive severance payment. Potentially only if you have a positive severance T. So, okay, so that's the key idea. And now we explore how wages are set. But it's clearly that at this point, this is what the firm does, because W2 is set at the beginning. Remember that the wages are set at the beginning, and therefore there is no reason at this point whether these two are going to be equal. Now, what is the optimal wage? Now, and then with math I'm almost done. Now, of course, wages must be, what we economists say, must be incentive compatible. In particular, you want to have a second period wages. Now, the first period we will take, the first period wage will have a different role. I will tell you in a second. What should be basically the idea is that you need to offer the worker a sufficiently steep wages, in the sense that you will get a higher wages in the second period if you invest. Okay? That's the idea of incentive compatibility constraints, what it says here. Now, suppose that the worker does not invest. What does he do? If the worker does not invest, he gets B because he's fired for sure. Okay? He's going to be fired, so he's get the outside option B. But of course, he might be lucky that he win the court, because the court can basically compensate him, and he gets B plus Q. If he doesn't invest. If the worker invests, what is going to get? He's going to get the high wage, W2, only if productivity is above the threshold. So that's why you have 1 minus F. If the productivity is below, he will get the outside option plus T. Okay? So you want the second period wages to satisfy this condition. So there is a moral hazard problem. The wage must basically solve this moral hazard problem in having the worker investing. Okay? Since the worker can get away with it, it says, why should I invest? Well, because you will get a better wages in the second period. Okay? And you want the wage to solve these issues. Now, what about the first period wages? The first period wage will help to solve the worker participation constraint. So basically that it is optimal for the worker to accept the job. That's the wage contract. Okay? Now, basically, it's clearly that if T is 0, we already know that there is too much firing. Okay, if severance payment is 0, since we have to offer this high wage. Okay, remember at the beginning I told you that we wanted wages increasing with tenure, and in reality they do it. But here I told you a story for why wages should be increasing with tenure. Now we have too much firing because, of course, wages are larger than B, and so there's going to be too much firing. So basically what we do is says, okay, what is the optimal severance payment? What is the severance payment that make ex post savings exactly equal to the efficient separation? Okay, so that's the idea of T star. Is that basically is that since we know what is the optimal separation in period 2, the efficient one, let's assume, let's calculate what is the severance payment that ensure that this is the case. And basically is this very extremely simple formula, does not depend on the distribution. It's C, it's equal to the investment cost, but you see it's discounted by 1 minus Q, which is basically is the Q is the probability that it gets away with it. Okay, so 1 minus Q is less than 1, so this is larger than C. Okay, and that's the basic story that I wanted to tell you. And let me sum up on efficiency. So if you have no severance payment, so now we have a story for severance payment. Basically, we have too much layoff. So you need an institution. Under this condition, you need an institution to help you to ensure efficiency, and severance payment can help you. Okay? So if you don't have it, there is too much firing. Now, if Q equal to 1, then it's irrelevant severance payment. Basically, if Q equal to 1, there is no way you can incentivize because the workers always get away with it. But that's typically not the case. Workers cannot get away with it. In other cases, you have this key formula which says that we know that severance payment should be like to that level. Now, two implications which are important is that we already learned something. These are speculation, but they are useful. Is that typically we can say that where it's easier to monitor worker, what is this Q? It could be that in small firm, it's easier to monitor worker than in large firms. So if that is the case, and this is true both for the employer than for the court, then this Q, this probability of getting away, is smaller in small firms than in large firms. Then larger firms need larger severance payment. That's one of the features that you typically have in legislation. And that's one interpretation of Q. The other one is that suppose that Q has to do also with the efficiency of the legal system. So basically that if you have a more efficient legal system, you should have a higher Q. Okay? So basically, severance payment should be larger in larger firms and lower in countries with a more reliable legal system. If you have a more reliable legal system, basically, it's more difficult to get away with it, and you should have lower severance payment. So these are two implications that potentially we can get back toward the end. Okay. Now, then we do two more things in the talk. First, we extend the issue to end periods because we want to understand whether a long-term contract makes sense. So here it was only 2 periods. We go to end periods and we say, okay, it's still one job and one firm, and but the job lasts end periods. The math is more complicated. I only want to give you only the solution. Then we also do go to the general equilibrium, which I don't have it in the presentation. But what's because the end period potentially is a long-term contract, and we want to know the efficient severance payment, is it increasing with tenure? And what we did find is this one, is that that basically the optimal severance payment. So the severance payment that what is the optimal one? Is the one that ensures that firing is efficient in every period, should be increasing in tenure. If this QT is the probability of getting away, it does increase with tenure, or if CT, which is the investment cost, is increasing with tenure. So what does this mean in terms of plain economics? CT increasing with tenure means that there is a marginal cost of investing which is increasing. The idea of marginal cost being increasing with tenure makes some sense, and if this is the case, you want basically legislation to take into account. Or if QT, what does it mean QT increasing with tenure? It means that that's more difficult, maybe that judges are more lenient toward more senior workers. It could be or it could be not. It's not obvious. It can be reasonable, but that's what it is. Under this condition, then the severance payment that you want to design, the efficient one, is actually increasing with tenure. Okay? And that's a very important result for thinking of these labor contracts that we are discussing. Now, another things, and I'm slowly moving toward the conclusion, that we take is that we take extremely seriously the legislation, as I told you. So we discuss even like the idea of a burden of proof. And this is, let me just tell you the story here. The story is that suppose that basically the court in time 2, what happened is that the investment in period 1, the investment, it's a draw from maybe a chart, it's simpler. Okay, so what happened is that the productivity, if you don't invest, you draw from a value of productivity from alpha plus beta. Okay, alpha beta is basically suppose that if you don't invest, you still are going to draw. So it's a more general model, and you draw from a uniform distribution alpha and beta. If you do invest, what the investment does? Investment shifts to the right the distribution of productivity. It makes the job more productive, and it shifts the productivity by a factor capital delta. So you see that it shifts to the right. Now, the issue is that you have an area on overlap. You have an area of overlap in which basically that if the productivity is going to be here, you don't know whether the worker did invest or not. And this is has to do with what will the court observe and who has the burden of proof. Because if you read the legislation, there is a huge dimension of the burden of proof in a separation. Who has the burden of proof? Is the employer or is the employees? Now, and let's give you a sense of this chart probably help. Now, look at the burden of proof of the employer. So it's the employer who has to make the case that is the worker who did not invest. The judge, if there is a doubt, the judge says, no, it is the worker was an investing worker. Okay, so severance payments are due. So the blue area, it's an area of uncertainty because potentially can come from both, and the court is going to say, well, it was an investing worker, and that, of course, has implication in terms of behavior, in terms of efficient severance payment, which is very different from a case in which the burden of proof is on the worker. If the burden of proof is on the workers, the area of uncertainty is much smaller, because if the worker it's here and the judge has a doubt, it says, oh, it is the worker who did not invest. It is the worker who needs to prove, to convince the judge that he did invest. In this different, of course, the details of the optimal severance payment change, but the formula turned out to be fairly persistent. This idea that you have this C over 1 minus Q, it's somewhat similar. Now, of course, you have potentially, when you introduce this topic, you start realizing that it could be also the firm having a moral hazard problem. Because all the story I told you, it's about the worker which can get away with it. But think about the firm. The firm, in this case, can have an incentive and say, no, it was an investing worker. It was, I don't want to pay severance payment. It was the worker who did not invest. So it is the firm who wants to get away with it. That basically, it is an economic dismissal in which severance payments are due, but the firm tries to pretend that it was a worker who did not invest. So in reality, it's a double moral hazard problem. So the worker has one, that he can get away with it, but also the firm does. And in fact, we end up rationalizing why the unfair economic should be the largely imposed fee, in fact, which is the case in most existing legislation. Okay, so I'm done. Let me just give you two empirical implications to conclude. We go back to the data. For example, we should observe two things, that in countries which have a steeper wage profile, severance payment should be larger, and then countries with less efficient legal system, severance payment should be higher. These are only correlation, are suggestive, but we get back to it. So here we basically relate the wage-tenure elasticity index. So we know in each country wage-tenure can be more or less steeper, and we link to the how severance payments are steeper, and there is some suggested observation that this is the case. These are countries. The other one is on litigation rate and the compensation for dismissal, and again, in countries in which the litigation rate is larger, severance payment tends to be larger. So litigation rate larger basically is a sense of a less efficient judicial system. Okay, I'm done. So hopefully you get the idea that you need a wage story. So you should also remember that severance payment should be neutral. Under a standard market, they should be irrelevant. Now, but if wages are deferred, they can prevent inefficient filing. So they are not neutral, and we have a story for them. Now, then, if we extend it to end period, do we get a story of, do we need severance payment to be increasing with tenure? Are they the way they should be set? Yes, if the worker needs to repeatedly invest on the job. So if you have this marginal cost of investing increasing in tenure. So we tend to, at the end of this long road, we tend to think that this idea that is going around in Europe of this labor contract, which Poland to some extent I want to learn more the details, since to have for employees, why they don't get to that when it's something I want to learn, should be basically taken seriously. So thank you very much.
Thank you.